Good day. Today is Wednesday, 7th May 2025, and the big news over the last 24 hours has been the enormous escalation in conflict, in fighting between India and Pakistan since India began its military response to the terrorist attack in Kashmir about a week ago. Now, I say tremendous escalation. Maybe it is not, in fact, such a big escalation. It is very difficult to say exactly what is going on. There have clearly been some Indian missile strikes on positions, what India refers to as terrorist infrastructure within Pakistan. The Pakistanis are claiming that they have shot down 2 Indian fighter jets, 2 French-built Rafale fighter jets operated by the Indian Air Force. India categorically denies this. I say categorically denies this. I've not seen any statements by the Indian government denying it, but the Indian embassy in Beijing has criticized Chinese reports that referred to Pakistan shooting down these 2 fighter jets. And for the record, I have seen absolutely no evidence that these fighter jets were indeed shot down. In these kind of situations, all kinds of claims get made, and one has to be extremely careful. They may be true, they may not be true. To repeat a point I've made many times in many places, I am not there on the ground. I don't know what is going on, and it is not always easy to get a precise picture. There is no doubt also that some civilians have died as a result of the Indian strikes. Pakistan is shelling across the border. I would say that at least in Britain, in the media that I've seen, the British media that I've seen, most of the coverage has come from Pakistani media agencies, and one has to also again allow for that. Though, as I said, I don't want to stress again, I am not fully familiar with exactly what is taking place. The Indian Foreign Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, has been in touch with various Gulf states, and he's apparently described the Indian response as proportionate. Pakistan, by contrast, calls it an act of war. It is giving warnings that India should not underestimate Pakistan, all suggesting that as far as the Pakistanis are concerned, there is some kind of real danger now of an out-and-out conflict between Pakistan and India. And as one would expect, most of the big powers, well, the big powers, the United States, China, Russia, are also calling for restraint, and for all we know, all kinds of diplomatic activity is now underway to bring the situation under control. Now, 2 days ago, in my video, I discussed the quite obviously urgent attempts made by Pakistan, the Pakistani government, to try to get the Russians to act as mediators, to use their influence over India to try to at least mitigate the Indian response. Now, Russian media, the Russian media, mainstream media, has been reporting some developments, and what they've been saying, and it's been I've read it in some Russian newspapers. What they're saying is that when Putin and Modi spoke to each other about 2 days ago, Modi said that whilst he was by no means averse to diplomatic contacts from the Russians about the conflict, India did not want a kind of public mediation, which is the sort that Pakistan seems to be angling for, the kind of event that took place in the mid-1960s following the fighting in Kashmir that took place then, when the Soviet Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin brokered a meeting between the Indian and Pakistani governments in the Central Asian city of Tashkent, now the capital of Uzbekistan, which led to the Tashkent declaration that came out shortly after, which brought the fighting on the line of control back under control. And, well, I can completely understand why India might want to take that stance. I mean, they would probably welcome the Russians conveying messages between themselves and Pakistan. But I think that a kind of meeting like the one that took place in the 1960s might be seen in India itself as India taking a step back from the strong action it is taking following the terrorist incident, which it clearly blames on Pakistan. And besides, I remember from the history that after the meeting in Tashkent, there was considerable dissatisfaction in India about the outcome. So I think that, for all I know, there are diplomatic contacts underway. The Russians might be speaking to the Indians and they might be speaking to the Pakistanis. China might be doing that also. But if there is that kind of diplomatic activity taking place, which I don't know that there is, by the way, then it is happening undoubtedly in private. Now, I'm going to say straight away that it seems to me that India does have the advantage here. Firstly, it is inconceivable that the Russians will do anything that will jeopardize their long-term strategic relationship with India, in which they place enormous value. Of course, if it is true, and I am sure that it is true, that Pakistan has been supplying shells and other weapons to Ukraine, then the Russians will have no interest anyway, will not be particularly keen anyway to pull the coals out of the fire for the present government in Pakistan, which they will feel has acted towards them in an extremely hostile way. So the Russians will no doubt do what they can to try to prevent the situation spiraling out of control, because they do not want an all-out conflict between two nuclear powers, which are located, well, not that close to Russia, but not that far either. And, well, China has a very long, historic, strategic relationship with Pakistan, and will no doubt try to assist in whatever way it can. It values its relationship with Pakistan and is deeply invested and committed to it. But at the same time, I can't imagine that China really wants to find itself in all-out confrontation with India over this precise issue, especially given that doing so would create a massive fracture and perhaps even a breakdown of the BRICS, which it is China's priority at the present time to build up and develop. I would quickly add that I am not sure what exactly it is that China can do in this situation over and above what it has been doing already. It already supplies arms to Pakistan and will not be happy if Pakistan has diverted some of those to help Ukraine, just saying. No doubt it provides Pakistan with a significant amount of intelligence information. I can't imagine that China wants to reopen the entire issue of the border, wants to return to clashes and confrontation on the border between China and India, something which over the last couple of months the Chinese have been working very hard to try to bring under control and to reopen the dialogue with India over the issue of the border. So I can't imagine that China will want to start any incidents on the border at this time. And of course, the idea of Chinese troops coming to to Pakistan's rescue is completely out of the question. And as far as I know, Pakistan is not requesting it. So, in all of these circumstances, Pakistan is to some extent on its own, and it has large armed forces. It is a nuclear power, but of course, India does ultimately outmatch it. So, I still believe that at some point over the next couple of days, after India has made its point, we will probably see an end to the fighting. Perhaps the Russians will facilitate with that. Who knows? But I suspect that, as I said, there will be at some point an end to the fighting. But India does have the advantage, and I think it would be unwise for Pakistan in this sort of situation to seek escalation, for example, by conducting raids of its own into India, which could escalate the situation further in circumstances where, as I said, India does have the advantage, both militarily and politically and economically. It is perhaps a difficult thing for the leadership in Pakistan to understand or to accept, but there it is. It is the reality. And any policy, any foreign policy of any state, if it is to be successful, must be based on the realities of the situation. Now, having said that, on the Indian side, I think that India, for its part, also needs to act with some measure of restraint. It needs to remember that Pakistan is a nuclear power. If it pushes Pakistan too far, then there is a real risk that the situation could indeed spiral out of control, which would by no means be to India's own benefit. And of course, at the end of the day, India may have a clear military advantage over Pakistan if Pakistan has shipped large quantities of ammunition to Ukraine and is short of ammunition. That advantage will have increased, but realistically, India does not need and won't benefit from an all-out war, even if the risk of nuclear weapons can be put to one side. So I think that the Indians have decided to make their point. Given the nature of the terrorist attack, I can't say that surprises me. But they need to act with wisdom and restraint and not push this point beyond where it works for them and they gain advantage from it. And Pakistan needs to really start thinking very hard, it seems to me, about where its policy is taking it. It probably will want to retain, I suspect within Pakistan, the issue of Kashmir is too important to be simply abandoned. But does Pakistan really want to continue to associate itself or to give base areas to groups that involve Pakistan, in clashes with India, a far more powerful country, and moreover do so at considerable moral cost if Pakistan is indeed involved in some of the activities of these people, as has been widely alleged, and as the past behaviour of some of Pakistan unfortunately gives plausibility to. Is it really in Pakistan's interests to continue to do this? Just saying. And is the entire course of domestic politics in Pakistan really working well for Pakistan anyway? Was it really a good idea to engineer the removal of Imran Khan, the Prime Minister? He might have had many critics and opponents within Pakistan, but he was hardly a threat to the stability of the nation whilst he was Prime Minister, whereas it seems to me that arresting him has indeed created precisely that crisis. Is it really a good idea to follow the bidding of the United States on these kind of questions? Has that worked to Pakistan's advantage? Did it work to Pakistan's advantage when it became deeply enmeshed in Afghan politics, supporting the Taliban, who now appear to be giving quiet assistance to an insurgency against Pakistan in Baluchistan? As I said, I think that there needs to be a review in Pakistan of its long-term policies and positions. And I'm not suggesting here a capitulation or a surrender to India or a policy of appeasement of India or anything of that kind. But what I am suggesting is that the time is long overdue for Pakistan to take urgent measures to stabilize its domestic politics, and to do so that those politics finally do start to serve the best interests of the Pakistani people, as opposed to the various geopolitical ambitions, not just of powerful lobbies within Pakistan itself, in the military and its foreign policy and its security establishment, but outside powers, including, of course, our old friends, the neocons in the United States. So anyway, this is what I'm going to say about the situation at the moment. Of course, an awful lot more could be said, but I will repeat again a point I have made previously. I am not massively well informed about the details of this particular conflict, or indeed the whole Indo-Pakistani conflict in general. I have my own frank biases. I have been somebody who's been fascinated by Indian culture and civilization since my time as a student, and I won't pretend that my understanding of this conflict is to some extent influenced by those biases. It's true of every commentator, and it annoys me that they are generally so unwilling to admit to that, both to themselves and to the people that they're addressing their comments to. But as I said, when it comes to India, I have a long historic, a personal engagement with India and its civilization, and that does inevitably colour my understanding of any conflict which involves that country. But nonetheless, I think that probably the points that I have made are valid, even if you allow for those biases. I think India has the advantage, but in its own interests, it should not push this further or too far. Whereas Pakistan has a lot of internal things to sort out, and perhaps it really needs to start focusing on those. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about this conflict. I think the moment has also come to turn now to various other matters. Now, in my program yesterday, I began by discussing the failure of Friedrich Merz, the man who is indeed now Chancellor of Germany, to be elected Chancellor on the first vote at the Bundestag yesterday. And, apparently after an awful lot of agonizing, a decision was made to hold the vote again yesterday. One wonders exactly whether the malcontents who voted against or abstained on the first vote were identified and spoken to. Who knows? But anyway, a second vote did take place, and this time Merz was finally elected Chancellor. So I believe that as of the time of making this programme, he has indeed been confirmed as Chancellor by President Steinmeier. Though I might, for all I know, be wrong about that also. I'm not familiar with the domestic procedures that exist in Germany. I would make two obvious points. The fact that 18 MPs of the coalition refused to support Merz in the first vote, that 5 appear to have voted straightforwardly against him, remains shocking, even if he has now managed to get across the line. Moreover, I understand that even in the second vote, he didn't get the full support of all the MPs of the coalition. They number 328, and he won the votes with the votes of 325. So that suggests that there were 3 votes missing. And I wonder why. Were some people ill and unable to attend the Bundestag session? Did they quietly decide not to vote? Who are these people? Questions which we, of course, don't know. But in all other respects, in every other respect, it seems to me that my comments about Merz, which I made in my programme yesterday, remain valid. He has been elected Chancellor of Germany. He won the elections in February, won is the right term, on a disastrously weak vote, around 28%. The lowest vote share that the CDU-CSU achieved in Angela Merkel's day was 32.5%. Merz polled significantly below that. Opinion polls in Germany show that he is not only not especially popular, but with a significant section of German society, he is actively unpopular. And all his moves since the election have shown him opportunistic and cynical, even beyond what Angela Merkel used to be. And of course, he doesn't have the skill that she undoubtedly did have in hiding her tracks. It doesn't look at all promising. He looks a weakened and damaged Chancellor with an unenthusiastic coalition at his back. And to be frank, I really do wonder how far this government will go, the extent to which it will be able to hold together. One good friend of mine, who's probably watching this programme, has said that he gives this government 8 to 10 months. That might be right. Maybe it will be longer than that. Governments don't fall very easily in Germany. But this looks an unhappy coalition led by an unpopular chancellor who doesn't really understand the nature of the problems that Germany is facing and doesn't have the experience or the political skills, or so it seems to me, to take Germany forward in any significant way. Well, that's the situation in Germany, it seems to me. We've gone from Merkel's long years of immobilism and stagnation to the chaos of the Scholz years with the disastrous policies that were followed during that brief but very unhappy government. And if possible, we're going to end up with a government that is worse still. Now, I have very strong connections with Germany. I know the country well. I like it very much. I've have friends there, and through my wife, family there. And it is dismaying to me how quickly things in Germany are going wrong. A country which was able to do many things because the funding to do them was there, is now starting to experience significant fall off in funding for all of these various projects. Life is becoming more difficult for many German people, and well, we see how 20 years of, I think, government taking Germany in completely the wrong direction is making everything go worse, faster and faster, with no sign that there's ever going to be any sort of change. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say briefly about the German situation. Now, today, as I said, is the 7th of May. The Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, is on his way to Moscow. Other world leaders have already arrived in Moscow. President Lula of Brazil is already there. I saw him exit his plane. There's been large numbers, but the Russians have provided a long list of the 29 leaders who are coming to Moscow to celebrate the Victory Day celebrations there. And there will no doubt be intense discussions. But of course, the most important visitor is Xi Jinping, the leader of China, who I understand is also, as I said, arriving, or perhaps has already arrived as of the time of making of this program. And he is doing so a few hours after an announcement that China and the United States have finally begun their first talks with each other on the tariff question. And Global Times has made it absolutely clear that the initiative for these talks came from the United States. They're quoting the Foreign Ministry, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman. The title of the article is "Upcoming China-US Trade Talks Are Arranged at US Request." Chinese Foreign Ministry on Chinese Vice Premier to hold talks with US representatives in Switzerland. And we are then told that regarding China's expectations for the upcoming talks between Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng and US representatives in Switzerland, and we are told, by the way, from the United States that the major US representative at these talks will be the US Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. Anyway, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Xian said on Wednesday that the US side has recently expressed its willingness to engage in negotiations with China. The meeting is arranged at the request of the US side. Lin emphasized that China's firm opposition to the US's arbitrary imposition of tariffs remains unchanged. We have stated on many occasions that China is open to dialogue, but any talks must be based on equality, mutual respect, and reciprocity. Pressure or coercion in any form will not work on China. China will resolutely safeguard its legitimate rights and interests and uphold international fairness and justice. Now, already I see that in sections of the US media, particularly those relatively few sections of the US media that have been supportive of President Trump, you can count them with your hands, by the way. But anyway, there is still attempts to try and pretend that it's the Chinese who've basically buckled and have agreed or pleaded for these negotiations. It seems to me all the facts show, and of course the Chinese Foreign Ministry says, that the initiative for this came from the American side. And probably the single event that dictated this outcome was a meeting that apparently took place between top officials of the administration, including perhaps President Trump himself and top US retailers, in which the administration was warned that if the economic war against China continued for many more weeks, then shortages would soon start to appear in US shops. The frantic stockpiling of items that took place before the imposition of the tariffs can only provide goods to satisfy demand for so long, and that period can probably be counted in weeks rather than months. So I suspect that despite constant efforts by the US to try to push the Chinese to make an offer to speak to the United States, to approach the United States, with President Trump making all kinds of claims repeatedly denied by China, that Xi Jinping had contacted him, that there were ongoing contacts between Xi Jinping and President Trump. It doesn't seem as if there were. Anyway, despite all of that, somebody finally in the United States, in the administration, made the decision, perhaps as recently as yesterday or the day before yesterday, that a meeting with the Chinese, negotiations with the Chinese to bring these tariffs down, had become essential, and the request to meet in Switzerland was made to the Chinese, which they've accepted. Now, I say that because yesterday reports were appearing in the US that US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was himself saying that there were no talks at that time with China about reducing tariffs or anything of that kind, that no actual talks had got off the ground. So it looks as if, as I said, somebody in Washington made a decision that this was not a position that could be sustained for much longer or any longer, and the decision was done to finally approach China and get China to agree to discussions in the way that the Chinese have always basically said they would do. Now, that may sound like the United States has made some big concession to China. I'm going to say straight away that in reality, I think this was entirely the correct thing to do. The Chinese obviously wanted to make their point. They said that the Americans started this whole game of increasing tariffs. Therefore, it was for the United States, not the Chinese, to make the first move. It's clear that it was in the United States that supplies of goods were threatening to run out, obviously not in China. So I think it was entirely the correct decision to reach out to the Chinese and to start discussions. It would be a huge error to jeopardize the future of the US economy and the livelihoods and businesses and jobs of millions of people on an issue of face. So whoever made that decision, and ultimately it must have been the president, to get these talks with the Chinese finally underway and to forget this nonsense about waiting for the Chinese to make the first move, made the correct decision, and it was the proper decision to make, and in a sense it was a strong decision as well. Now, what is going to come out of these discussions? I'm going to suggest that perhaps the wisest step going forward would be for China and the United States to agree together at this meeting in Switzerland to bring down these colossal tariffs each has imposed on the other, to more rational levels. Of course, both sides have now imposed bans on the imports or exports to the other of certain strategic goods. The United States continues its game of trying to prevent exports of high technology, especially in electronics, to China, even as the Chinese electronics industry and AI industries develop and advance by leaps and bounds. Why people in the United States think that taking these steps is wise is another matter, but anyway, that is what they have been doing. I doubt that the United States is going to walk all that back anytime soon. The Chinese, for their part, have been placing their own restrictions on the exports of rare earths and all sorts of things of that kind with respect to the United States. And again, until there is some full resolution of the trade issues between these countries, I cannot imagine that the Chinese are going to rush to walk that back either. These sanctions, if you like to call them that, it seems to me that that is what they are probably seen by each side, more correctly by the Chinese, by the way, as providing them with leverage, critical leverage, over the other. Just saying. But nonetheless, that shouldn't get in the way of bringing down some of the other humongous tariffs that have been imposed, so as to allow trade between China and the United States to resume again. And hopefully that will happen. Maybe the tariffs will be brought down, the US tariffs will be brought down to, say, 10 or 20%, and we'll have trade talks begin in earnest, maybe in Switzerland, to see whether some long-term settlement can be achieved. Now, those trade talks might be interminable. They might not have any very satisfactory outcome. And if the tariffs are reduced in the way that I think, inevitably and unavoidably, the Chinese will come away reinforced in their belief, which they already have, that with respect to trade negotiations with the United States, they are negotiating from a position of advantage. That was why this whole idea of imposing these massive tariffs was, from an American point of view, in my opinion, always a mistake. Far better not to have made so visible the extent to which, in trade negotiations, it is China that has the stronger cards. But anyway, it was done. We might have negotiations underway. Doesn't prevent some tariffs remaining in place, but not these sky-high tariffs we have at the moment. There is something else I want to say, however, about this story, and that is that we're now just beyond the first 100 days of Donald Trump's presidency, start of Donald Trump's presidency, or to be more precise, his second term. And I think it is fair to say that that term began very strongly. We had all the various operations of Doge, of Elon Musk. We had the effective closure of USAID. We had the vast raft of executive orders. And then we had attempts to reach out of Russia to settle the conflict in Ukraine. We had the pressure on Israel to agree a ceasefire with Hamas. We had the first outreach to Iran to conduct negotiations with Iran. Now, we are now past the first 100 days. And I have to say this, it seems to me that the momentum of those first days, of the first 2 weeks, is draining away. Firstly, we hear an awful lot less about Doge than we did. And Elon Musk, from having been a key figure within the administration, seems to be preparing quietly to return to work on his businesses. He doesn't seem to be as involved in policy at the center of power in Washington as he was previously. Instead of a major reduction in budget spending, the American budget deficit has actually grown, and the most wasteful part of the budget has increased massively, with a $1 trillion spend on defense, even as the US military, especially the army, is apparently about to be reduced in size. So it doesn't seem as if the United States is bringing its fiscal situation back in order. The administration has proposed a budget which, if you disregard the enormous increase in defense spending, does offer or does propose cuts in spending in other areas. I personally believe that the priorities here are all wrong. I think the United States would achieve an awful lot more by cutting defense spending and prioritizing that over other cuts. But that is a personal point of view. My own view is that once we get through the budget process, we will find that Congress is going to restore many, if not most, if not all, of the cuts that the administration is proposing to the budget, so that the US budget will grow even further. That inevitably means that debt levels are going to increase still further in a year when the United States has to roll over $9 trillion of existing government debt. The US Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, has said that America's debt trajectory is unsustainable. It is difficult to disagree, but I can't myself see that anything fundamentally is changing. So that's where we are on the key economic issues. Note that we do have some tariffs. We do have some move towards protectionist policies. But there is no sign of anything that can really be described as an industrial strategy, as a real plan for turning the US economy round. Certainly, if the intention in imposing the tariffs was to recreate the kind of structures, the so-called American system that existed in the time of President McKinley back in the 1890s and for decades before and after, and which many people today see as the foundation, providing the foundation for American economic success and American power. Well, we see nothing like that at all. The government, the administration, is still mostly focused on tax cuts. There's claims that these tax cuts will favour the wealthy at a time when the budget deficit is increasing in the alarming way that it is. I wonder whether the kind of tax cuts that are being discussed are really the right way forward. But anyway, whatever. Even if they do benefit some people in the economy, I don't think they're going to change things fundamentally overall. So, economics, domestic policy, the big things there are not being achieved. And in foreign policy, it seems to me it's the same. It was starting in February, a big effort to try to resolve the crisis in Ukraine and to establish some kind of rapprochement with Russia. We seem to be nowhere close to achieving any of that. The White House spokesman, or rather to be more precise, the State Department spokesman, Tammy Bruce, says that it looks as if progress is being made to try to agree a peace settlement in Ukraine. The framework of it, if we were to withdraw as a mediator would come if we don't see progress of the parties, and we do recognise, and everyone has to, that both parties must come up with the proposals for an enduring peace. So that was Tammy Bruce. So, they do see progress, they do see the parties making progress. I'm completely unable to see any sign of progress in achieving a peace in Ukraine at all. The ceasefire idea has clearly failed. The Ukrainians refuse to engage the Russians in negotiations. As we will see shortly, the military situation on the battlefronts is escalating, and there isn't any sign, not a whisper of evidence, as far as I can see, that the military events are slowing down or changing direction, or that anybody seriously is thinking about a ceasefire. We've had the investment fund deal, which, as I've discussed in many previous programs now, is completely different from the original mineral rights extraction deal that Trump proposed after he became president. It doesn't seek to recoup the funds that the United States has instead spent on Ukraine. It appears to be the creation of an investment vehicle into which the United States can continue to pour in funds into Ukraine, to minimal benefit, by the way, to the people of Ukraine. Here, I should acknowledge some information I have been provided by, in private, by a correspondent who's pointed out that the limited partnership agreement, the most important part of this document, of this whole package of agreements, under US law, cannot be published. It is protected by very strong rights of commercial secrecy. And I absolutely acknowledge that that is the case. But frankly, looking at the agreement, I don't think there's any reason any longer to doubt that what we're looking at is the classic investment fund agreement that the United States has made with many other allies and proxies and satellite and vassal states in the last 30, 50, 80 years, when it has been the world's most powerful country. And again, I suspect what happened was that the president was very, very keen to get an agreement to show that he'd achieved something on the Ukraine conflict front within his first 100 days. Eventually, the point came when it looked as if there was a risk that there would be no agreement at all. So the matter was shuffled off to the bureaucracy in the US Treasury Department and perhaps the State Department. And they did what bureaucracies always do. They simply churned out essentially the same type of agreement that they are familiar with conflicts that have happened in other places and before. And as I've said, quietly, gradually, maybe without exactly realizing it, the president is drifting towards a position of, again, supporting Ukraine in much the same sort of way that Joe Biden used to do, though without Biden's same level of fervour and conviction. And, well, on the other big issue, which is Iran and the Middle East generally, well, There are no attempts any longer to put pressure on the Netanyahu government to change course on anything that it is doing. And whilst it looked a short time ago that we were on the cusp of some sort of breakthrough in the nuclear negotiations with Iran, with Iranians also anxious for an agreement and pointing out that they've never actually wanted to acquire nuclear weapons, and with the Russians making all kinds of proposals about how they could facilitate the agreement with Iran, with which they now have strong treaty relations. Well, whilst it looked for a short time as if this agreement to prevent any possibility of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons was within reach, all that has melted away as the president and his officials have reverted back to the policy of demanding that Iran give up every aspect of its nuclear program, not just those parts of the nuclear program that could lead to the acquisition of a nuclear weapon, but the civilian nuclear program as well, including presumably the civilian nuclear reactor in Bushehr, which has now been completed and put into operation with the assistance of the Russians. So Iran is not going to agree to that, not only because it wants a civilian nuclear program, but because it knows, as night follows day, that if it ever conceded on that sort of thing, it would simply lead to further demands that it give up its ballistic missiles, that it essentially disarm its entire armed forces, that it cut off its assistance to the Houthis in Yemen and Hezbollah in Lebanon, that it switch off its rhetorical backing for Hamas, things which the Iranian government simply isn't in a position to do and to survive politically if it did. So, given that the United States is again insisting on going beyond the question of Iran's nuclear program and is making all of these other further demands, it looks to me as if the negotiations with Iran are also in deadlock. And if they are in deadlock, and if they do fail, then as night follows day, we're going to be back very soon with the talk about launching an attack on Iran. It bears remembering, it bears repeating that the President's National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, was apparently sacked from his position as National Security Advisor and transferred to the post of UN Ambassador because he was lobbying with the Israelis and was working with the Israelis to lobby the White House to authorize an attack on Iran. And of course, that was not what the president wanted, but it shows again that there are those voices within the administration that demand it and which are now going to be emboldened following the likely failure of the negotiations to demand it even more. The one bright, flickering light in this picture is that the president is now saying that the current military offensive against the Houthis in Yemen is about to be called off, that the United States is proposing to end this operation against the Houthis. Whether it really does so, of course, is another question. The operation has been a complete failure. It seems that another F-18 fighter has been lost. I say that, maybe the photo I've seen is a photo of the previous F-18 fighter that was lost. Anyway, the Houthis have been bombed. A number of their leaders have been killed. A fair number of civilians have been killed as well. And I cannot see that anything useful has been achieved. Now, way back in the 1990s, I think, Boris Yeltsin's Prime Minister, Viktor Chernomyrdin, made a famous comment about the various attempts that would be made in Russia in the 1990s to carry out economic reform. Anyway, Chernomyrdin said that, we wanted to do our best, but everything turned out as always. I'm starting to think that this is how we're going to see things play out with the Trump administration also. They came in, it was all frenetic activity in the first few weeks, closing down USAID, closing down the Voice of America and all of that, exposing all kinds of problems within the governmental system, revealing the extent to which the US's budget was completely out of control, trying to rein in spending, do other various things of that nature, conduct radical changes in US foreign policy to retrench against US interventionism. And, well, after an awful lot of noise and thunder and activity, everything has gone back, or seems to be going back, to the way they were. Now, of course, there will be some people, in fact there are people, who say that that was the intention all along, that all that we have seen over the last few weeks, the drama, the excitement, the attempted change, the gear shifts and the swerves of direction, that it was all theatre. And I can say that there are quite a few people in Russia specifically who do believe that. There's always been deep suspicion of the diplomatic outreach that the Trump administration has engaged in. My own view is that actually it is far worse than that. It is much more likely that governments in Washington have so little control now over the administrative machine that whatever they try to do, ultimately it self-corrects and puts the United States back on the same unsustainable course that it was in before. And I have to say, if that is right, then that is far worse than the idea that there was some deeply laid scheme to deceive people in Moscow and Beijing and Iran and those kind of places, because that would suggest that the people who appear to be in control, the administration and its officials, actually are in control. They may be wicked and duplicitous, but they know what they're doing. Whereas in fact it looks to me, frankly, that they're not in control at all. I doubt, frankly, that at this stage in American history anyone really is. Anyway, that's my general thoughts about the existing situation. Now, in a few days, the Russians will be celebrating Victory Day. I say a few days, in 2 days' time, we're going to have the big parade in Moscow. We're going to have the big celebrations. The leaders are going to be there. The talks between Putin and Xi Jinping will probably begin today. There will also be meetings between Putin and Lula. The Russians have tried to get the Ukrainians to agree to a ceasefire over the 3 days that these celebrations were underway. They've pointed out that this is not just a victory for Russia against the Germans and what they represented in the Second World War, but it is a victory for the Ukrainian people too, because the Ukrainian people were a part of the Soviet Union, and the vast majority of them fought with the Soviet Union, as part of the Soviet Union, to achieve that victory. Well, of course, that does not impress Zelensky and his team, his associates. They've rejected the proposed Russian ceasefire outright, and they have been busy escalating. Now, over the last couple of days, they've been making repeated attempts to try to break into Kursk region again. The objective seems to be to try to capture a small village on the border with Ukraine called Totkino. There's been apparently an impressive concentration of Ukrainian forces on the border, all of them aiming to try to capture Totkino. So far, all of these attempts have been unsuccessful. What they are doing, and I've seen ample footage of this now, is that they're adding to the catastrophic losses Ukraine has already suffered as a result of the Kursk operation. Ukrainian troops who try to attack in Kursk find themselves immediately attacked by Russian drones, Russian artillery, Russian paratroopers who are defending this territory. Many of these Ukrainian soldiers get killed. Many more vehicles, armored vehicles, get destroyed as well. And so far, nothing of any significance has been achieved. There's been some suggestions that the Ukrainians control one or two houses in Totkino. But, well, even if they take the entire village, what then? What exactly do they think this is going to achieve now? And, well, perhaps they think that they can repeat the events of August last year, when, after a couple of days fighting, they were able to capture the town of Suja and penetrate deep into Kursk region. But this time, the Russians have far more forces in the area. They're presumably prepared for this kind of thing. All of the indications suggest that they are prepared for this kind of thing. How is this going to help or change the situation in any particular way, given that the Russians, because they're prepared for these attacks, will almost certainly be able to repel them, as they are currently doing, successfully right from the outset. But anyway, one can sense the political urgency that drives the Ukrainians to try to do this thing. One can guess that Zelensky and Yermak and Podolyak and all of these people are telephoning Syrskyi probably by the hour, demanding updates on the situation in Totkino, that Syrskyi has to deal with these demands, this endless procession of demands. And probably they're all backed by threats to sack him and do all those kind of things. So he probably is concentrating more and more forces to try to capture this village of Totkino. And, well, all I can see is that it again plays to the advantage of the Russians. Meanwhile, Ukraine has also been launching attacks, drone attacks, on Russian territory on an increasing scale. Now, a couple of videos ago, I said that I'd noticed that there had been a long period of time over the course of which Ukraine did not seem to be conducting big drone attacks against Russia anymore. Well, it's now obvious why, because it looks as if the Ukrainians were stockpiling drones in order to launch huge numbers of drones against Russia for no other purpose, as far as I can see, than to disrupt and spoil the Victory Day celebrations in various Russian cities. And reports say that last night up to 500 drones were launched by Ukraine against targets in Russia. Well, there's inevitably been some footage of drones doing some damage in a few places. But again, the overall story here, as far as I can see, is of a pinprick attacks. The fact that you have hundreds of pinprick attacks doesn't change the fact that they are still pinprick attacks, even if there are lots of them, and nothing of substance has been achieved at all. The Ukrainians are apparently now giving reassurances. There was an article, I think it was in the Washington Post, which said that they don't intend to strike at Moscow itself on Victory Day. As I discussed in my program 2 days ago, they've been given very strong warnings against doing it. But anyway, it looks like they're going to try and attack in all sorts of other places, and they're expending huge resources in trying to do it, and they're not meeting much in the way of success. Meanwhile, the Russians also last night launched their own missile and drone strike right across Ukraine. Note that this isn't just a drone strike. Apparently missiles were used as well. I am not able to say what damage exactly all of these missiles, these Russian missiles, did, but I gather that it was extensive. But you'll have to wait for the next program for me to see if I can provide an update. So hundreds of drones on the Ukrainian side achieving minimal damage, probably fewer but bigger and more powerful drones on the Russian side, backed by missiles and doing a lot more damage. The Trump administration, this goes back to my point about how the Trump administration is in effect ending up doing the same as always, has dusted out, apparently, an old Biden-era plan. I suspect that work on this Biden-era plan, and probably the funding for it, was provided before Joe Biden ceased to be president, by the way. So it probably isn't anything new. But anyway, they're all moving forward with a Biden-era plan to transfer to Ukraine an old Patriot missile battery in Israel, which has been taken out of service. Apparently this has to be updated, and that requires American technical officials and assistance. And, well, there are plans to try and hunt down and find another Patriot missile battery somewhere in Europe. It was suggested at one point that it might be Greece that would supply it, but the Greeks have refused, and everybody now expects that it will be Germany. And I gather this is also a relatively old system, though I may be wrong about that. Now, there have been some claims that this means that Ukraine will have been supplied with 10 Patriot missile batteries altogether. I think that this fails to take into account observable losses. If you go back to some of my earlier videos from last year, you will find that, especially during a period in the spring, the Russians managed to destroy a significant number of Patriot missile batteries that the Ukrainians were very unwisely seeking to deploy close to the front lines. I doubt that even if, or rather when, these 2 Patriot missile batteries are supplied to Ukraine, we will have 10 batteries in total. My guess is it could be even as few as 5, just saying. But there are already American media reports that say that however many batteries, Patriot missile batteries, Ukraine now has, it really isn't going to make a huge amount of difference, because the fundamental problem is that it's not a shortage of batteries, it is a general shortage of Patriot missile interceptors for those batteries to launch. And, well, this goes back to a topic that Brian Beletic has covered in program after program, the production rates of Patriot missile interceptors. They've never been especially high. Perhaps they've ticked up a little, but they don't come anywhere close to fully meeting Ukraine's needs, given the kind of missile offensive that the Russians regularly engage in over the skies of Ukraine. Now, about 3 weeks ago, I actually got an insight into an intelligence assessment that the Russian military has provided to the Kremlin. The Russians estimated there, that there are somewhere in the region of 3,000 Patriot missile interceptors in existence around the world. The problem is that is nowhere near enough already to provide missile coverage in the Indo-Pacific region in the event of a conflict with China. All of those batteries, all those interceptors would be used up in a matter of just a few days. And of course, if you're already expending Patriot missile interceptors in Ukraine, you're diverting Patriot missile interceptors to Ukraine, and Ukraine has to launch those, and it has to launch large numbers of Patriot missiles in order to make a significant difference to Russian missile strikes. And I remain a skeptic about the Patriots' ability to shoot down hypersonic missiles. In fact, I continue to be of the view that it has scarcely ever been done. Well, anyway, the point is, if you're starting to use Patriot missiles in Ukraine, then of that stockpile of 3,000, you will start to run through hundreds of them, long before you ever find yourself in a situation of conflict with China at all. There is a critical shortage of Patriot missile interceptors, and there simply isn't any simple way of getting round it. That is the first thing I'm going to say about missile attacks. But a lot is happening also currently on the front lines as well. Firstly, to repeat again a point I have been making in program after program now for about the last 6 weeks or so, we are clearly in the early stages of a Russian offensive, which I suspect is going to continue right through to the end of the year. At the moment, the Russians are still conducting shaping operations. They're preparing the battlefield, if you like, and before they commit their larger forces and before the more sustained offensive begins later in the spring or summer. But already we are seeing events unfold, and we can get a clue or a sense of where things are going. Now, in one of my recent programs, I discussed the fact that there's been an enormous number of rumors that the Russians have crossed the Dnieper and have established bridgeheads on the Ukrainian-controlled part of the Dnieper in Kherson region. I have not seen any factual evidence that this is the case. I've not seen any film or photographs of this kind confirming that this is indeed happening. But there is no doubt at all that there is a huge amount of chatter about this across the internet, and there's articles now appearing which suggest that the Russians have indeed established bridgeheads in several places now on the west bank of the Dnieper, both to the south and north of Kherson city. And, well, I think by my calculations, we're talking about at least 3 bridgeheads, and they're sufficiently close to each other that one can imagine that all of these various bridgeheads might at some point link up, at which point you would get a critical mass, like we've seen with the bridgehead that the Russians have recently established across the Oskol River in Kharkiv region. And of course, when that happens, dramatic things might start to follow. This is an area where the Ukrainians apparently are not numerous in number. They've had to transfer large proportion of their forces to try to hold positions in Sumy region and close to Konstantinovka. And for that reason, it's not entirely impossible that the Russians have indeed established these bridgeheads. I'm not saying that is the case because, as I said, I don't know. But rumors to this effect are becoming widespread, and they're becoming more detailed, and they're becoming so detailed that it's almost an indication that they might be true. What is indisputable, because it has been apparently confirmed by the Ukrainians, is that the Russians have gradually taken control of practically all of the islands in the Dnieper River. And the other thing I should say is that there is also a very substantial Russian force located on the east bank of the Dnieper under the command of General Teplinsky, 130,000 men, I've seen some say. A force certainly large enough probably to advance in Zaporozhye region towards Orekhov and to capture Orekhov and to create an advance positions to march on the city of Zaporozhye on the east bank of the Dnieper, but also perhaps to conduct this cross-river operation in Kherson region and to perhaps threaten and potentially capture the city of Kherson itself. Just saying. So maybe later this year, maybe in the summer, we will learn that all of this is actually happening. In respect of the Russian bridgehead in Kharkiv region, on the north and western banks of the Oskol River, I would say that the Russians clearly crossed the Oskol River and established their bridgehead and began to expand it several weeks or at least several days before the fact was confirmed. And it may be that we're starting to see the same thing. Now, if we look at another part of the battlefront, which is Pokrovsk, a couple of days ago, I reported how it seemed that a Russian sabotage and reconnaissance group had entered the southern outskirts of Pokrovsk. There was an awful lot of pushback from people who said that this simply wasn't the case, that 2 random Russian soldiers ended up in southern Pokrovsk. That, I, by the way, think is inconceivable. If you look at the positions of the front lines, it is inconceivable that just 2 soldiers walking by themselves would enter Pokrovsk in that kind of way without being part of some kind of military operation of some kind at least. But anyway, the point is that there was these reports about the Russians having entered Pokrovsk, and there was footage which the Ukrainians themselves provided which showed that this was the case. It is also indisputable that the Russians have been conducting a massive artillery and missile preparation on southern Pokrovsk and the neighbouring town of Mirnograd, which perhaps ought to be understood as an industrial suburb of Pokrovsk, over the last week or so, which also looks like it's intended to prepare the ground for some kind of military operation in Pakrovsk. Well, as it happens yesterday, the Russian newspaper Redovka came out and said that the Ukrainians needed to be careful because the Toretsk precedent looked like it was about to repeat itself in Pakrovsk. In other words, infiltration into the urban areas of what is supposed to be a fortified city by reconnaissance groups, Russian reconnaissance groups. These groups then establishing themselves in buildings in the southern outskirts of the city, supported by very heavy artillery and missile fire and by airstrikes. And then these groups gradually expanding their control and becoming reinforced until a critical mass is created, leading to an advance inside the city itself, which in the case of Toretsk led to the collapse of Toretsk's southern defenses and set in motion the whole series of operations which eventually resulted in the fall not just of Toretsk but of the entire urban conurbation of which Toretsk itself was a central part. So this appears to suggest that something like that might be either in the course of happening or about to happen in Pakrovsk itself. An infiltration of the city from the south, the gradual establishment of a critical mass of troops there, and then a further advance deeper into the city with the Ukrainian defenses beginning to crumble. Now, I would say that Pakrovsk is very different from Toretsk. Toretsk was a part of a very complex conurbation of industrial villages and suburbs and factories and coal mines and things of that kind. There are factories and coal mines located on the territory of Pakrovsk itself. That is not so different from Toretsk, but it is all much more compact, and there isn't a string, a widely spread out circle of villages and communities around Pakrovsk that form the same kind of urban conurbation as the one that one sees and saw in Toretsk. So if the Russians break into Pakrovsk in that kind of way, even as they gradually tighten the pincers around Pakrovsk from the east and the west, as they're currently doing, then my guess is that Pakrovsk will probably fall much more quickly than is being imagined. That is my guess, much more quickly than Toretsk. One would be the case in Toretsk. Elsewhere, the Russians also continue to advance. In fact, if you disregard these attacks that the Ukrainians are carrying out near the village of Totlino in Kursk region, the Russians seem to be attacking right across the battlefronts, and there's been more news of further significant advances by the Russians in the Konstantinovka area. So, it seems to me that once we are past the May 9th celebrations, as May moves on, as we get drier and hotter weather, well, the situation is being shaped for a significant Russian offensive involving significant numbers of troops, and at least in the context of the four regions, we could be seeing attempts by the Russians to gain control of all of the territory of the four regions that remains under Ukrainian control. The three cities in Donbass, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, and of course the town of Pakrovsk. Zaporozhye city itself, Kherson city as well. Could it be, just saying, that the Russians are now talking to themselves about doing all of that, maybe then coming to the Americans and say, look, you talked about the fact that it made no sense for us to take all this territory. We have to be handed over all of this territory. The Ukrainians weren't prepared to give this territory. We have therefore now taken it. I wonder what will happen if we ever do get to that particular point. J.D. Vance, the US Vice President, is now saying that the United States is no longer really seeking to set up a 30-day ceasefire. They understand that that isn't going to happen, that they're looking at negotiations, trying to get negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians going in order to work on a final settlement. Well, Zelensky shows no interest in that. I suspect that even if the 4 regions fall under Russian control, he won't show any interest in it either. I expect the war to continue, in other words, for quite a long time now. But anyway, that's, it seems to me, the situation on the battlefronts as of today. The Russians continue to advance. The Russians continue to conduct enormous missile strikes that do real damage. The Ukrainians, instead, continuing their PR war, trying to break into Kursk region, trying to disrupt the celebrations of the victory parade, a victory day in Russia. And the Americans basically lost, very uncertain what to do. And with the Trump administration having lost momentum, are now talking to the Chinese about trying to find a way out of the economic problems that the tariff war has created. Well, that's my program for today. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.